Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at our webinar on access to education for students experiencing homelessness during the COVID crisis. We'll go through a couple logistics before we get started. So on GoToMeeting, you will see that there's a spot for questions. You can type in here. And sorry, excuse my PowerPoint skills for the rapidly changing slides. So GoToWebinar has a place to ask questions. Please feel free to type them in at any time during the presentation. We will have a question and answer session at the end where we will compile your questions and ask them to our panelists. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a couple poll questions for you, so please be on the lookout for those. And as we go, we always welcome live tweeting. We're at NLCHP Homeless on Twitter. So we have a great panel today. We have Paige Jogi, the staff attorney at the Education Law Center. We have Alyssa Phillips, education staff attorney at the Law Project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. We have Margaret Bingham, she's a grassroots leader at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And we have Patricia Julianell, the senior strategist for program advancement and legal affairs at Schoolhouse Connection. And we have me. I am the staff attorney for youth and education at the National Homelessness Law Center. My name is Brandy Ryan. You'll notice that the Law Center has a little bit of a new name, and you can still reach us at all of our old places under the NLCHP name at our website and social media, but we are officially now the National Homelessness Law Center. A little about myself. I'm originally from Louisiana. I did my undergrad at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and law school at the University of Michigan. After I graduated law school, I did a 6-month fellowship here at the Law Center, and I was officially hired as an attorney just about a year ago. So I'm going to leave most of the talking today to the wonderful experts we have on our panel, but I want to start with a little bit of a primer on McKinney-Vento education provisions because they really drive everything we're talking about today. I know that a lot of people on this call are lawyers and advocates, and many of you probably already know all of this. It's probably old hat for you, but I hope that it's new for some people and that this is something new that they can bring to their clients and ensure that people are getting all the rights they're entitled to, especially as we go through this eviction crisis. So the McKinney-Vento education provisions ensure equal access to education for students experiencing homelessness. What this means is if they lose their housing, they can stay in their schools, even if losing their housing means they don't have an address in a school district anymore, and they even live outside of the school district. They're allowed to stay in the school with their peers, with the people they know. Schools are also required to remove barriers to education for homeless students. So that means providing transportation or aid with transportation, making sure they have whatever equipment is required to attend school. So during this COVID time, that might mean making sure they have PPE. It also ensures full participation, which means not only participation in class, but no separation from their peers, full participation in activities like sports and clubs. And it also includes an appeals process, which we have a little more about in our toolkit. So this toolkit we just updated to include some COVID information, but it really lays out, hopefully in an easily digestible way, what all these rights are, who counts as homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act, because it's a little more expansive than you might see in other laws. It includes people who are doubled up, people who are couch surfing, people who live in hotels and motels. So even people who might not consider themselves homeless might qualify under this and have rights to schooling that they might not be receiving right now. So this toolkit lays it all out. It's honestly where I go if I can't recall something about the McKinney-Vento Act. And we've got easy links to it here, or you can go to nlchp.org/publications and click on the youth and education, and you'll see all of our youth and education publications, including this one. There's a Spanish version, but it's still being translated for us. At least the COVID update is still being translated for us. So you'll find last year's version in Spanish. It just doesn't have that COVID update. But the COVID update really just says nothing changes. Schools still have to remove barriers to education. So I also want to introduce the State Index on Youth Homelessness, which is a resource that we at the Law Center create with True Colors United once a year. And it grades states on the environment for students, well, for unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness. It rates some education metrics like partial credit, but it also delves into broader services like whether unaccompanied youth have access to food stamps or education, and whether there's a youth council on homelessness in a state. So with all of that said, I will switch us to, I will flip over to Paige Jogi, our first panelist. Sorry, excuse me. Paige is a staff attorney at the Education Law Center, where she represents students, conducts trainings, and advocates to address individual and systemic educational barriers facing students in Pennsylvania. She's responsible for leading the Education Law Center's Philadelphia-based Black Girls Education Justice initiatives. Paige joined ELC's staff in 2017 as an Independence Foundation Public Interest Law Fellow, with a focus on eliminating individual and systemic barriers to quality education for students experiencing homelessness in the Philadelphia region. Paige is going to talk about centering equity in reopening. And Paige, I am giving you the controls.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Paige Jogi. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a staff attorney at the Education Law Center, as was mentioned. I am not sure that I have control yet. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you should have it, Paige.
Let's see.
But I can just.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me see if I. Can you see what I'm doing? Show. Do you see?
I can't see it, but I don't think I can see what everyone else is seeing. Sorry, folks. Why don't I just do it on. Oh, it says waiting to view your screen. So I can just take it back and we can.
Can you see now? Nope.
Oh, yes, now I do.
Oh, okay, perfect. Let me start the show. And if somebody could just affirm that you can see it, we'll be on our way.
Oh, it looks like other people can't see it.
Uh-oh, show? How about now? It says not showing anything. Let's see.
It looks like it's just my face on the screen.
Show, okay, here.
Now
There.
I see.
Can you see? It says
Yes.
showing. Yes, great, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience with technical difficulties. This has been an endemic part of COVID-19 for me, and I'm sure many of you all as well, as we learn to navigate these new systems. I wanted to start out with just a bit of brief information about Education Law Center. We are a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring access to a quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. We effectuate our mission by prioritizing equal access to quality schools, adequate and equitable funding to schools, and dismantling the school to prison pipeline, also known as pathways to confinement. And as mentioned before, I'm a staff attorney, and I also lead the Education Law Center's Black Girls Education Justice Initiatives, as well as specialize in assisting young people who are experiencing homelessness and their families. So today I hope to cover what does our current education system look like, what are some opportunities for schools to better center equity to support eligible students, and what are some promising practices and tools that we can all use to make equity a part of our school's foundation and not just an afterthought. So our education system is on a foundation of inequity. Nationally, we have racially segregated and locally funded public schools, and our system was designed to be and continues to persist in being anti-poor and anti-Black through both policy and practice. So what you can see is through research that districts with the most economic security and resources mainly serve white children, which has made the transition for students in those locations much easier. And we know that barriers to permanent and adequate housing also stem from racist housing policies and practices, as well as systemic denial of opportunities. COVID-19 made visible many of the barriers that were invisible and highlighted in real-time new barriers and that change day by day that harm the students that we're trying to serve. And inequities in our schools play out in our larger community ecosystems because schools do more than just educate their systems for socialization, for resource connection, and so these inequitable outcomes permeate. And here are some things that schools do, like provide education and childcare and specialized supports and services, access to qualified specialized personnel, and connection to resources. And we can't accept a return to normal that perpetuates educational deprivations. So here's a quick case study on Pennsylvania, which is where I practice. Pennsylvania has some of the most racially segregated schools in the country, as well as the largest wealth gap between districts in the country. When schools were first physically closed due to COVID-19, inequities took center stage. Some adequately funded school districts had an immediate migration to online platforms, one-to-one devices for every student, increased mental health supports, and robust supports for the adults, undertaking many of the functions of schools. In some cases, I saw students having more resources than they would in the school building overall. Contrast that with some of the underfunded school districts who opted to offer nothing, full stop, literally nothing, to students, citing equity concerns, most of which predated the pandemic. And ultimately, the Pennsylvania Department of Education issued guidance that schools did need to continue to educate children through continuity of education plans, but those differed significantly. Another aspect of the continuity of education plans that's worth mentioning is they did have some guidance that referenced something like school stability for all students. So McKinney-VENTO can serve as a model for serving all students more equitably. And this year, schools continue to have wide latitude in reopening, which further cements inequities. There's a link here to our reopening guidance, which does prioritize equity and flexibility, but we still have a long way to go. So what can schools do? Well, they can adopt an appreciative inquiry by meeting families where they are and offering supports. Oftentimes, depreciative language is used to describe our students and families, when instead schools should be thinking about what can they do to support. And the families we're serving, and many of our own, are dealing with a lot right now. They're experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. physical health concerns, mental health concerns, financial concerns, and grief on a collective and individual level. They also might be navigating how to manage additional trauma caused by racist responses to COVID-19, police brutality, and the anti-Black racism following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others. Say their names. And so relationships really do matter. Schools should foster relationships and proactively offer supports to students and increase student participation by frequently communicating in a variety of languages and modes. Google Translate is totally insufficient. I see school districts using this all the time, and so you end up with messages that are muddled, that don't communicate things, and can put families in a really tough situation. So the order of words in languages can be different. So if you're describing the character Pink Panther, in some languages that would be Panther Pink. And so Google is doing a verbatim translation, and so that does not meet the state or federal requirements for language access. Building strong relationships with families also means that families know that they can go to schools for access to community-based resources, such as where to go for mental health supports, where to get food, where to access public health information, and access informational hotlines. In Philadelphia, that's 311, but there are often local community resource hotlines that have up-to-date information in real time that can be really beneficial for our families. And schools should also support families without assuming any access to resources, so providing help getting technology, using it, and obtaining consistent and reliable internet. So what else can schools do to assure equity? Well, equity should be at the school's foundation. If you click the link on this PowerPoint, the Pennsylvania School Board Association has a wonderful equity continuum that describes how schools can make equity the school's foundation. Schools should use a universal eligibility screen for all students, which will identify families that are now eligible, ensure students who have been identified receive adequate protections, and it also helps eliminate stigmatization that can arise if a tool is selectively used. And make sure that the tool is appropriately and correctly translated to meet the linguistic diversity and needs of a school community. I've seen many screens translated into Spanish that ask the question whether or not the physical space is rented or owned rather than if the family rents or owns the space, and doesn't take into consideration that a lease or a deed doesn't necessarily mean that a family has access to adequate housing, which is also contemplated by the McKinney-VENTO Act. Schools can also screen for other needs like school supplies, internet devices, and hotspots, connecting families to resources that are specific to them and updating families in real time as these resources change, and providing families access to information about community-based resources. Creating systems that contemplate that families might suffer subsequent displacement also helps streamline education and connection to school during times of transition. So schools should not just assume that one move is going to be happening. In COVID-19, we know many more students are eligible, and displacements, in fact, many in a row, might be the reality for many of the students and families that we serve. Pennsylvania has taken one great step to make this easier to identify who can serve you in the local school district, and they have a McKinney-VENTO liaison directory that is updated frequently and helps students and families identify resources. So if you click the link, you can put in your address if you're in Pennsylvania, or search one if you're just curious, and it will show who's the contact for the school. So if families are moving, consider providing them the information to the next liaison for a seamless transition. And address the needs of families and unaccompanied students who are essential workers. Consider that they might need more time to turn in work, they might need meeting times at work around a schedule, and they also may be navigating additional stressors and pressures. So mental health support should be proactively offered that are community-based and culturally responsive. Education Law Center also has an equity checklist, which you're welcome to check out to ensure that Black and Brown students, students who are experiencing homelessness, and students who are historically and currently underserved are centered in the COVID context and beyond. Just a quick spoiler alert if you're curious. This tool focuses on ensuring equitable access to remote instruction and technology, adequate supports and services during the pandemic, and also opportunities to ensure that families are given the resources and supports they need to be fully engaged at school. So as was mentioned before, there are enduring protections for McKinney-VENTO eligible students. The one thing I wanted to flag here is that immediate enrollment definitely still applies, and enrollment means access to school and full participation. So when students are immediately enrolled, They need to be able to immediately, and immediate means immediate, immediately participate in all necessary courses and should be given all materials and supports during the enrollment process. Federal rights have not changed, and McKinney-Vento eligible students are legally entitled to these protections. As was mentioned before, there is also the affirmative duty to revise policies and practices that preclude identification, enrollment, attendance, or success of eligible students. So I want to end on a good note of some promising practices. In Pennsylvania, we've seen shared spaces for McKinney-Vento liaisons to connect with each other, which makes transitions between schools and districts more seamless, and also as a center for innovation. We've seen a lot of liaisons sharing great policies that are being adopted elsewhere and creating a culture of serving students. And McKinney-Vento liaisons also can initiate affirmative and proactive check-ins to provide resources and supports, and share out current and local public health information, facilitate warm referrals to school-based supports and school personnel who might be able to help. So if the liaison wants to connect the student to their teacher or to somebody else who could serve them, that can go a long way, especially if the family has a positive relationship with the liaison. And liaisons could also continue to provide check-ins to address new or anticipated needs. Our families often know what they need, but they're not being asked, and they might not be being asked about what they might need in a week when their situation might be vastly different. So make sure that when you're checking in with students and families, the now is important, but being future looking can go a long way to ensure that students' educations aren't disrupted any more than they already have been by the pandemic or experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. Devices can be delivered directly to families and unaccompanied students who are unable to go to access points due to increased risk for transportation barriers. And schools should normalize themselves as purveyors of support by screening for school supplies and other needs that can be provided directly from the school. Schools also must consider revising attendance policies to account for barriers that could arise from needing to quarantine or otherwise address COVID-19 risk or exposure. So what else can schools do? They can universally screen families, communicate using a variety of modes, and I put some up here like mail, phone, internet, school-based communication, and community-based information like food distribution centers, healthcare centers, summer programs, corner stores, and health clinics. It's really important that families have a variety of ways to interact with the school because they may not always have the phone, they may not always have internet, they might not always be able to be in touch with schools. So where families are going for resources, schools should meet them there and also provide support. That way information can be delivered in real time to families and does not rely on families having access to resources that may be even more scarce during pandemic times. So as a recap, our school systems cannot and should not return to inequitable normals. Schools need to operate on a foundation of equity and flexibility, which requires a lot of intentionality and dedication to making sure that our education is anti-racist, that everybody who interacts with students has proper training, and that young people are being supported. Promising practices better center student needs, ensure that schools can fully comply with McKinney-Vento legal obligations, and provide McKinney-Vento eligible students with the access to affirming and supportive environments, which they are legally entitled to, very much deserve, and require to thrive. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to fielding questions at the end. I'm going to stop sharing so we can proceed. Thank you all for your patience and time today.
Thanks, Paige. So here we go. So now I'm going to pass it along to Alyssa Phillips. Alyssa's the education staff attorney at the Law Project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, where she provides direct representation of homeless students and families in educational matters, conducts trainings on educational rights of homeless students, and advocates for rights and resources for homeless students and families. She was hired by the Law Project in September 2019 following a 2-year Equal Justice Works Fellowship. She earned her law degree at the University of Notre Dame and her bachelor's in political science from Wheaton College. Alyssa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Brandy, for that introduction, and Paige for all that wonderful information that you provided. So what I'm going to be talking about today is giving a little snapshot on the work that we've been doing in Chicago. So you can go to the next slide. But so we're the Law Project, as Brandy mentioned, and the Law Project was founded in 1997, and we host a Youth Futures Mobile Legal Clinic, which launched in 2004. So the Law Project provides civil and limited criminal legal services to unaccompanied homeless youth and families. And the Youth Futures is a mobile legal aid clinic for homeless and unaccompanied youth, staffed by 4 attorneys. And so our education work kind of centers in this, and our model is to go to where clients are and where families are, as a big barrier for the educational rights of homeless students is access to those legal protections that they need. And so we try to always get to where clients are, which has been particularly difficult during COVID with safety. And that's caused us to kind of shift some of our focus and to be creative with how we reach families and how we reach students, which also can be some good models for schools to also be supportive and engaging with families and students. So you can go to the next slide. So one of our big things that we did was shift our focus on which cases we take. So most of the time, you know, as Paige mentioned, we are making sure that schools are following the federal McKinney-VENTO Homeless Assistance Act, as well as our state laws and regulations and policies that protect and give rights to students who are experiencing homelessness. In light of COVID-19, we really shifted to making sure that students experiencing homelessness were being able to access distance learning and to fully participate. You know, for a lot of homeless families, school is that centering force, right? It's a place of stability and of safety. And students experiencing homelessness have a right to stay in what is termed their school of origin. And so that place is, they're allowed to stay kind of despite being transient or where they are living. And so it was very important that in some capacity that consistency remained. So we worked to do a lot of advocacy, making sure that students had access to the technology that they needed, to computers, to Wi-Fi. If that was not possible, making sure that they were receiving paper packets, that there was access to those programs that they would need to fully participate. And I think one of those issues that we really saw early on with COVID is that a lot of families didn't know what was happening with the school. You know, Paige mentioned something that's really important for equity is having multiple ways to reach out to families and to connect with families. And I think we really saw that barrier where, you know, if the school did a robocall, not every family is going to have equal access to a data plan each month. They might have a device, but not a data plan, and might not receive that robocall. Maybe they don't have consistent access to email or a device where they can access email. And so it was very hard for them to just get basic information about what the school was even doing. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the first things that we really focused on was how do we engage parents and families? How do we make sure we're serving our clients and that families' voices are being heard? And so we formed what we titled our CPS focus group, so Chicago Public School Focus Group. And what we did is look at former clients that we had served with educational rights issues, and then the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless also has an organizing department, and we work with folks with lived experience of homelessness to organize around advocacy to support homeless families in different capacities. So we reached out to you know, leaders and folks who had been involved in that work who we know had students in CPS. And we were able to work with our organizing department to set up these bi-weekly Zoom calls filled with parents and grandparents of Chicago public school students with lived experience of homelessness. And it has been one of the most just amazing and beautiful things to see, and has allowed us to do so much advocacy here in Chicago. I think we were able to really hear what the issues parents and grandparents and caretakers were experiencing, what information they really had, what information they didn't, what was creating barriers. And I think there were so many things that came out of that group that maybe you wouldn't initially thought about as something that was really needed to support homeless students. Obviously there were issues with, as Paige mentioned, inequities with getting computers and getting Wi-Fi hotspots. There were issues with just technological literacy, as a lot of unaccompanied homeless students are maybe living with a great aunt or a grandparent or someone who maybe isn't as comfortable accessing technology, so not knowing how to sign on to school portals or what they needed to do. And also, I think hearing about safety issues and even being able to get to the school to get computers, having that equal access to food and masks and hand sanitizers. While during the protests for George Floyd too, just safety in communities of being able to, get to the points they needed to get those resources. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the most kind of important strategies we really used for advocacy with the CPS focus group was media. So a lot of our leaders and parents gave these amazing interviews to the Chicago Sun-Times, to Chalkbeat, to WGN, some other local newspapers, and we had really positive results, and it created, I think, great pressure on Chicago public schools as people who maybe weren't as familiar with the state of homeless students. I think a lot of people don't think about school-age children as experiencing homelessness, or they don't think of the difficulties of families living doubled up, especially during COVID. If you don't have a safe place to self-isolate, if you don't have a physical space to do work with sickness and job loss. And so I think these media strategies and really getting stories out there played a huge part in us being able to advocate for some really great victories. You can go to the next slide. So one of the really amazing things that happened was when people were reading these interviews, they donated laptops and gift cards, and we were able to use that in sort of two ways. So one was to just provide these supports to families and to students. But the other thing that I think it did is it really did put pressure on CPS to provide this, because it showed the inequities, right? That there were some students who were able to get access to computers quickly and log on, and there were some who, weren't able to. And that, I think, was really significant in CPS agreeing to provide technological support to homeless students. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the things that we were very appreciative that CPS did agree to was to distribute 12,000 mobile hotspot devices to homeless students in CPS, as well as 100,000 computing devices. And I think to even CPS agreeing to distribute these devices showed some of the inequity, because there were schools that already had laptops, and then there were family schools that did not have those same technological advances, and so had to wait for CPS to figure out how to distribute these. Obviously, there's a lot of just logistics that went into it, and so there were time delays in families, and particularly families experiencing homelessness, being able to get the supports that they needed. But I think using parent advocacy, our parents, like I said, did media strategies. They also wrote letters, demand letters that we gave to the Students in Temporary Living Situations department at CPS, as well as the CEO and the Chief Equity Officer. And I think that also eventually led to CPS agreeing to work with the city of Chicago to implement the Chicago Connected program, which basically screens for students who live in areas without access to consistent Wi-Fi or free Wi-Fi, as well as kind of other factors that would limit their abilities to get it. And they're dedicating to giving those internet services to families. And I think a lot of that came from parent advocacy and parent voices that otherwise don't always get heard. So you can go to the next. So another really amazing thing that we worked on was with the Illinois State Board of Education. So, you know, one thing that we really saw, and Paige kind of alluded to this as well, is how every school district, every school seemed to kind of approach this differently, and that was a huge equity issue, as some schools just were more prepared, had more resources, and others were not. And so we really wanted some clear messaging from the State Board of Education to really give guidance to schools and what should happen to really support students who were experiencing homelessness. So the Law Project, we worked with our CPS focus group. We worked with MCKINNEY-VENTO liaisons throughout the state of Illinois, as well as some national partners. And we partnered with the Illinois State Board of Education to issue guidance to schools and districts on how to best support students experiencing homelessness in the upcoming year. The link to the guidance is on their homeless education page and their COVID-19 page. And they sent this around to schools. But I think one thing that was really amazing about this document was how comprehensive it is. And I think that came from getting input from so many key players. You know, getting input from parents and from liaisons and from national partners. You know, like there were things that came up when we were doing, you know, the various edits that maybe some people wouldn't have thought of. So, you know, one thing that the parents we worked with, you know, were really afraid of was if and when schools reopen, are there going to be increased, you know, disciplinary measures because maybe students experiencing homelessness don't have the same access to masks? And if schools are requiring masks, or if, you know, students are transitioning between shelters or different homes, living doubled up, maybe they forget their mask, maybe they lose it, maybe they don't have the ability to wash it, and then, you know, you have these increased disciplinary measures. And because homelessness is a racial equity issue, you know, fear around that also disproportionately impacting Black and Brown students. And so we were able to get language in the guidance, you know, about making sure there wasn't that increased disciplinary measures. I think another, you know, big thing that came up from parents that's in the guidance is about trauma support. So obviously, you know, I think to a degree, everyone has experienced trauma during the pandemic. But I think especially homelessness in and of itself is traumatic. But I think with everything going on, you know, COVID-19 was especially traumatic for homeless students and families. You know, I think when we look at disproportionately who was impacted, we know that Black and Brown communities were had higher rates of loss of lives and of illness. I think when we also just look at job loss and the fear that those students have in removing of that consistency of school and that safe place and the resources that school provides, I think it, you know, was particularly traumatic, and there needs to be support in schools to deal with that trauma before trying to just jump back into educational programming. You know, that's not going to be the most successful. And I think parents were really concerned about making sure there was space and time for that trauma support and for mental health support for students as they re-enter, so that we don't see this, you know, disciplinary and punitive measures being used for students who might be acting out because of this big transition. And we were able to get language about that in the guidance and some other really great supports. A lot of the things that Paige had mentioned, which then, you know, we can point to and use to really advocate with schools. And you can go to the next slide. So yeah, so I just took a screenshot of this, but like I said, it's located on their website. Go to the next one. Yeah, so I wanted to thank you guys for allowing me to talk. I also wanted to mention just really briefly, Two other really great resources that are not necessarily new during COVID, but I think have played a really great role that we use in Chicago. And one of those is the Streetlight app, which we've been using a lot during COVID. And basically what it does is has resources and supports for it. It's focused on homeless youth, but for anyone kind of experiencing housing insecurity, and it has features like book a bed at a shelter, closest health clinics, food pantries, and we were able to use it to also have updates for COVID and do push notifications. And so I think using those types of creative ways to make sure that youth and families have access to information. Another one is the Homeless Youth Handbook, which has been around for a little while and various states have, but we were able to have an updated COVID-19 chapter in it, which then can be used, and we trained a lot of CPS liaisons on that Homeless Youth Handbook and those resources that then can be another kind of source for families during those times. So I think COVID-19 really requires us to use a lot of creativity to really make sure we're hearing the voices of people who are impacted, and thinking about how we can engage and protect vulnerable students. So thank you so much, and excited to answer any questions.
Thanks, Alyssa. And we'll have to, we might have to talk about the Homeless Youth Handbook. We at the Law Center work on the DC version, so a COVID update is probably really needed here.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to, I know Brandy's going to say a little bit about Margaret, but she is one of our grassroots leaders, and she's going to be speaking a little bit about her experience, and she is an amazing advocate and an amazing mother to a wonderful student, and has been so instrumental in a lot of the advocacy we've been able to do at the Law Project.
Thanks, Alyssa. So we'll hear from Margaret now. Margaret, if you're still on the line, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Hi, Margaret.
Hello, everybody. My name is Margaret Bingham. I'm 58 years old, and I have a true serious health condition that provides me from going out as much as I need to recover because of a coronavirus. I'm currently experiencing homeless. I'm double up. I live in my niece's house because all the rent in Chicago are very expensive, and I cannot afford my own at the moment. I'm here to talk to you about my challenge with COVID-19. And my 11-year-old daughter, Mariah. She's an honor roll student in a CPS school. She is a very kind heart and is always looking out to help anyone that needs help at school. Since we both have serious health conditions, we do not go out too often. We only go out if it's necessary. We go out of the house if it's all doctor's appointment, to get food, to get more masks, and to pick up any medication that we might need. We're trying to avoid any CTA buses that are full. We make sure that if I get into a CTA bus, the bus has less than 15 people, and the people on the bus have a mask on. Not everybody outside is wearing a mask, and that makes me very nervous because my daughter can get sick, and with her asthma, it become very complex and dangerous for her health. I'm worried going out when the politicians in my neighborhood are giving out free face masks, but I have to go because the disposable masks are very expensive. I also go out to get food from shelters and line out alone because everyone in my neighborhood needs help. I visit pantries often to get fresh vegetables and canned goods. But every trip I take is a risk that I'm putting myself and my daughter in because wearing a mask will stand 6 feet away. I also go out when Mariah's school need me to pick up food, homework, or hotspot. My daughter needs those things to continue her education at home. And school is hard during this time. I'm worried about Mariah completing school is active home, being home hard about learning how to school online. It's hard to release and getting internet at our house for her to do her homework, clear her homework. I have to go out. I have no choice. I also have to pick up her medication. That's another thing we cannot live without. During the pandemic, I have it been very helpful to receive extra support with people giving out food, free food and masks in my neighborhood. Some politicians are giving out free masks. I live in a fixed income, so I cannot afford to keep buying disposable masks for Mariah and me. With Mariah being out of school, I have to provide more food because she's home all the time. It has been very helpful to receive some food from her CPS school. It helps. The pantry stand open is providing a safe way for people to receive food as being a blessing. Sometimes they also give free bus passes. They are very useful. I appreciate all the help that I can find for my daughter. I look everywhere for us to get what we need because it's important to me to keep her safe and for her to feel safe during these pandemic. Thank you, my Margaret. I'm glad to share and give my information on pandemic COVID-19, which is kind of hard. But me and my baby was up under doctor care, and there's certain food that we have to eat, and it's kind of hard again because we have to eat boiled, baked, or grilled food. So I kind of watch our food because my doctor gave us a list of how we're supposed to be eating with the pandemic that's going on. So I appreciate giving my lead to every and each one of y'all.
Thank you, Margaret. It's really helpful, I think, for all of us to hear what the challenges are and to think about how the pandemic is affecting not just education, but access to everything that people need to survive, and is making it harder for people to get out and get it. So we really appreciate hearing your voice.
And I need to say one more thing, if you don't mind, if I have 5 or 10 more minutes.
Sure.
Okay, but then again, what I'm worried about, like, if my baby do have to go back to school, I'm hoping that they can put it with the kids, like have an STLS or 504 plan. They can be put into one room with the ones that don't have the 504 plans. They can be put in a different room from them to keep things from they don't have COVID-19, and they need to like have like 10 classes, 10 students in a class apiece. Because if they have over 15, I'd be real tempted of my baby going into that classroom up on her health condition.
Yeah, of course. And that actually, that brings us to our next speaker, Patricia Julianelle, who I think might be able to touch on how schools are dealing with that. I know that some schools are potting up to make sure that students are only interacting with small groups. So now I'll pass it over to Patricia. She's an attorney and legal consultant for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations. She has over 20 years experience defending children's and youth's rights, including advocating for youth in education, juvenile justice, child welfare, and immigration systems. She's an expert on educational law and policy, including rights of children experiencing homelessness, students with disabilities, and undocumented immigrants. She's worked with many organizations, including ours, and led trainings for state and local education agencies, attorneys, and nonprofit organizations. And she, I didn't mention to begin with, is the senior strategist for program advancement and legal affairs at Schoolhouse Connection. Patricia, do you have slides? Do you need screen control?
No, I don't. Thanks,
Okay,
Wendy.
great.
Sorry I didn't prepare slides, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're hearing from school districts around the country in terms of challenges and approaches to address some of those challenges. And we heard very directly a lot of them just now from Ms. Bingham. So some of the challenges that schools are seeing, right now with most schools being virtual, there's a huge problem with just the basics of identifying students experiencing homelessness, which is always challenging, but now when there's not that physical contact between various members of the school staff and families and youth, many school districts are actually seeing much lower numbers this year than in other years, not because there's less homelessness, of course, but because they're having such difficulty actually identifying students. So schools are doing a lot of things to try to address that. They're doing as much outreach as they can to families and youth who experienced homelessness last year. They've lost touch with a lot of families and youth, though, just because school went virtual basically overnight in a lot of districts in the spring. They didn't have time to necessarily make sure that contact information for everyone was completely up to date, or to even put any procedures in place to make sure that families had the support they needed. So they're doing a lot of work now, and they have over the summer as well, to try to go back, find families and youth that they may have lost, so that they can re-identify them this year and just know where they are and make sure they're connected with services that they need. We're also really encouraging schools to make sure they're embedding McKinney-VENTO information in everything that goes out. So whatever communication is going out on whatever platform to alert families about, latest news, what are we going virtual, are we going in person, that everything includes information and questions that can help trigger identification of possible homelessness. So just asking people, have they moved recently? Have they lost their housing? Are they staying with others? Are they in an address that isn't permanent? Are they, for youth, are they staying with somebody who's not their parent or guardian? Just trying to identify those red flags. We're also really encouraging schools, and we're seeing a lot of schools who are increasing their community partnerships. So even if they were already working with partners as a matter of course, to really up their game in that regard, so that they're putting McKinney-VENTO information at laundromats, certainly at health departments. Ms. Bingham talked about people giving out masks, and a lot of school districts are giving flyers to whoever's giving out masks, whether it's the health department or politicians or others. If you're giving out a mask, give them a flyer about their the possible education rights they might have if they're in unstable housing, and how they can reach the liaison to get more information. I talked to a school district the other day who is in touch with the constables, and in her community they're called constables, in other communities they're called sheriffs or others. It's basically whoever executes evictions in that community, and getting in touch with them and giving them a flyer and saying, if you're doing an eviction of a family with school-age children, give them this flyer. They might not in that moment of crisis be able to hear what you have to say about school, but they might be able to go back to that flyer the next day and find the phone number for the liaison, and get in touch with that person and say, I just lost my home, but to know that your children have rights around that. And I've really been encouraging people to increase their partnerships with legal services as well, just knowing that a lot of families and youth might be even more likely than normal to try to seek out legal support for things like evictions right now. Schools, I think, are trying to get creative with outreach and communication. They're not necessarily the most modern in terms of online communication, so a lot of school districts, if you even think about using Facebook, which every young person I work with tells me that, nobody's used Facebook in 20 years and I'm way out of date, but, schools are even kind of struggling to get up to date enough to use Facebook. So they're trying to think outside the box and beyond their firewalls. And Facebook Messenger students, use apps, use Twitter, use Instagram, use Snapchat, try to meet students and families where they are technologically, and asking other students for help too. You can teachers, counselors, and others often know who are the friends in the school, and so they can say, hey, Patricia, I've really been trying to get in touch with Brandy. I haven't heard from her a while. I'm really worried about her. I know you're friends. Can you, text her and ask her if she'll call me? Or other ways to just try to get creative again, to try to find students that we may have lost touch with. In some cases, it's been months, since they've been in touch or since they've been able to track people down. A lot of schools are also providing prepaid cell phones to families and youth experiencing homelessness. I was talking to a liaison the other day who bought prepaid cell phones for all of her unaccompanied youth, and they're all paid up through the end of this school year. So they're paid up through June of 2021, hoping that that'll be a way to help her keep in touch if at least she knows, assuming that the youth doesn't lose the phone or doesn't get stolen, that that's going to be a reliable number that she can text or call for the entire school year and doesn't have to worry about service getting cut off. Also, again, talking about that outreach, I was talking to the liaison on rural Kentucky the other day. Again, she's really worried about unaccompanied teenagers and that she's lost touch with. So she's partnered with the health department. And again, as they're going out and they're doing testing, COVID testing, or they're providing masks, or they're providing alcohol gel or whatever, that they have flyers again, and they have information to share, and they can talk. They know enough about McKinney-Vento. They don't have to be experts, but they know enough so that they can kind of talk to a youth or a family and say, hey, here's somebody you could call who could help you get connected with school, help you get connected with school meals, etc. One thing about school meals that I just want to mention, kind of late breaking news that some of you may have heard of already. The federal government Food and Nutrition Service had issued a lot of waivers around school meals in the spring, allowing parents and guardians to pick meals up, that meals could be takeout, meals could be delivered. They waived meal time requirements, and they also allowed school meals to function under the summer food program rules, which are a lot more flexible in terms of the need to provide ID, the need to prove that you're registered in the school district, et cetera. It made it a lot easier for schools to give meals basically to anybody in the community, any student or any child, at least child or youth in the community who needed them. And we just found out that that particular waiver that allows school meals to function under the summer food program rules, that waiver will not be extended into the 2020-2021 school year. So that's going to make it a lot more difficult for school districts to make sure that students get their free breakfast and their free lunch when school buildings are closed. We're particularly concerned about students who are attending their school of origin. And previously they could just go to their local school and get their lunch and didn't have to try to make a trek across town to wherever their school of origin might be, but that's not going to be allowed anymore. Students are only going to be able to get their meals in the district in which they are registered. So this is kind of late breaking news, and schools are sort of reeling as they try to figure out how they're going to do this now. And so, if you hear about interruptions in food service, that's where some of this is coming from. And like Ms. Bingham was saying, nobody wants to get on a public bus right now that, might have people who might have COVID on it. If people do have transportation, their own cars, the financial burdens are bigger now than ever. So people aren't trying to have to fill up a gas tank to drive across town to get a free lunch for their child. So I think this is going to be a real problem, and it remains to be seen how schools are going to deal with it. Just a couple other things real quickly, because I want to make sure we get to time for people's questions. Of course, everybody is interested in access to learning and how are we going to get devices and connectivity and electricity for people. And I think there are a lot of strategies that schools are using. Certainly under the McKinney-Vento Act, if distance learning is in place, whether it's full distance learning or if it's a hybrid model where distance some days of the week, in person others. Schools have to eliminate barriers to access of that learning. So that means that if the student doesn't have a device, doesn't have internet, doesn't have electricity, then the school's going to have to address that. So most schools I'm in touch with are providing everybody with devices. They're providing mobile hotspots. They're providing chargers. I talked to a district the other day that's actually providing solar chargers. So that students can have electricity to keep those devices and those mobile hotspots running. I know in some really rural areas, connectivity is an issue because even with a hotspot, if there's no good cell service, a hotspot's not going to do you much good. So I've talked to some really rural areas that are still doing packets. They're still just actually U.S. mailing packets to people if it's too rural to just drive it out there on a school bus and drop it off. And doing learning packets. So obviously that is not ideal and not a great way to go to school. But it just depends on the different realities in terms of geography and resources that are available around connectivity in any particular place. I've talked to some school districts that are really upping their game in terms of just helping families connect. So just, you know, giving somebody a device and saying, get on your Zoom at 9:30 isn't sufficient for families or students who aren't familiar with using computers. They don't know how to connect to Zoom. And so the other day I talked to a district who's actually using McKinney VENTO money, and they've hired somebody for several hours a week whose sole job is to just walk people through the process, the step-by-step process of, okay, here's how you open the device, here's how you connect the mobile internet, here's how you turn it on, here's how you see what your signal level is, here's what Zoom is, here's how you connect, and making sure that that service is available to families who might not be literate in English. So again, that we're really walking them through step by step to make sure that they can connect and that they can get their children connected. So I thought that was something interesting that I just heard the other day. And right before I started talking, I know Ms. Bingham was talking about wanting to make sure that if students do go back to school virtually, that students like Mariah who have asthma or who have other health conditions that put them at risk, that they can be safe. So just to touch on that, you know, this is being done really differently district to district. So wherever you are on this call, your district might be all in person, might be a hybrid, might be all distance or some combination. But I do know that some schools, even if they are all virtual, so technically the school buildings are closed, they have opened up buildings for certain subsets of students. And oftentimes it is McKinney VENTO students and students with special needs in particular, to give parents the option of having them come in to kind of a virtual academy. So they're still doing the same online learning that everyone else is doing, but they have a place to do it. So they don't have to worry about connectivity. They don't have to worry about you know, electricity and those things. They don't have to worry about having a quiet, safe place to work, which you know, a lot of our students don't. One of our scholars that I was talking to the other day was doing her homework on the street corner outside of a McDonald's because she said it was actually quieter there. And she was able to concentrate better there than she was at the place where she's staying. And she was on the McDonald's free Wi-Fi. So we know that space and safety is a real issue. So with those virtual academies, you know, they can provide transportation, they're providing meals on site, they're providing a teacher to help the students connect to the distance learning and just provide some one-on-one academic support. And because it's only open to certain students, they're able to keep the population really low so that they can do social distancing and try to keep it as safe as possible and keep everything sanitized. So that is something that is in place in some places, I think not in most. That is not the norm. That was just something that I heard actually it was from a charter school in St. Louis, Missouri that I heard that the other day, but I know they're not alone in doing that. And an important thing is that is the choice of the parent. So it's an opportunity that's offered to the parent and the youth. But again, if the parent is concerned about their child's health and they don't want them in an environment with other people, then of course we wouldn't, you know, a school could never force someone to do that if the school district was closed and on a distance learning plan because of health issues. So I think maybe I can stop there because I don't want to just kind of drone on, and I'd like to give people the opportunity for questions. Maybe just the one last plug I'll make is just to, if you're interested in kind of what the federal Congress is doing about this, if you're watching the news, you'll know the answer is not much right now. But there is a bipartisan bill in both the Senate and the House called the Emergency Family Stabilization Act. And you can get information about this on our website, which is just schoolhouseconnection.org. And the Emergency Family Stabilization Act would be new funding, additional funding. It's not an existing program. It's a brand new program to provide grants to community agencies that would include schools, but also others, so that they can provide funding for a motel voucher, for housing, for eviction prevention, pay a utility bill, buy additional food for families, help families to get PPE, those masks and those other things they need. The allowable uses of expense of the money is really, really broad, and the money could be used to support any family or youth experiencing homelessness under the definition of homelessness that public schools use, which includes families in motels and includes families like Ms. Bingham's who are staying in the housing of other people temporarily. So if you're interested in doing a little advocacy and spending a couple minutes to drop an email to your member of Congress, jump on our website and you can get more information about the Emergency Family Stabilization Act.
Thanks so much, Patricia. We have a couple, well, before we get to questions and answers, I just want to say that that all of these slides will be available in an email in an email follow-up after the presentation today, and we'll also have a recording available in that email. And we'll try to get all of the links that have been mentioned throughout the presentation put into that email too. So I want to invite our panelists, if they want to turn on webcams so we can chat, but no problem if you're not set up for that. We have a couple technical questions first that I think are probably good ones for Patricia. Hi. So our first questions are there places that people can get real-time data on McKinney-Vento enrollment? And then people are asking for some information about things that we can use McKinney-Vento and Title I set-aside funds for. I know that there are some answers to that on the Schoolhouse Connection fact page, which we can link in our follow-up email, but if anyone has real-time answers to that.
I don't mind starting, and then I'm sure there are others who could fill in as well what I'm missing. But in terms of real-time data on the numbers of students experiencing homelessness in a particular school district, the person who would be able to provide that would be the liaison, the McKinney-Vento liaison for that district. Every school district and charter school has to have a liaison designated. I can tell you that that's a question that we've been asking a lot right now because we're really interested in what districts are seeing. And just because it's so early in the school year, a lot of people have been telling us, we don't really know yet. We're still pulling things together. So I can't say that you're going to be able to make a phone call and get that information, particularly right now. But there is, or there needs to be, there should be, there has to be someone in your local school district who's collecting that information. And as for the allowable uses of funds for McKinney-Vento dollars, it's a little bit more flexible than for Title I. So for those of you who aren't familiar, every school district and that would include a charter school as well, that gets Title I Part A money does have to set aside some of that to serve students experiencing homelessness in particular. And that set aside can be used to meet a variety of educational needs for students, whether they be, at elementary, middle, or high school level. So as Brandy said, it's a little bit kind of complicated and technical, so you can get more information on our website, but essentially that money can be used for things that are not typical Title I expenditures. So Title I usually, might support a reading program or might support teachers or things that are really academically focused. But the set aside is much broader, and basically anything that's going to help a student experiencing homelessness take advantage of educational opportunities and that's not available from some other source would be allowable under the Title I set aside. So for example, in a distance learning world, if you need a charger, you need a device, you need a hotspot, you need, earphones because there's so much noise where you are that you can't hear, those are things the student needs to be able to take advantage of educational opportunities. And if that's not available from another source, that would be something to spend those funds on. McKinney-Vento funds can be used for all that and more. And there's actually a list of allowable expenditures right in the law. And the last thing on that list is extraordinary or emergency assistance needed for students to be able to participate in school. So again, that's pretty broad. And it certainly can be creative in thinking that through in terms of the COVID-19 era that we're living in right now.
Thank you. So another question we have is about unaccompanied youth. How are concerns different for students who aren't living with families? We've heard a lot about especially distribution of things to families, devices and meals. So how are the concerns different with students who aren't living with guardians? And what opportunities and resources are there for them? And also, specifically in this time, like, we know what some of the concerns generally are pre-pandemic, but is there anything happening in the pandemic that's particularly applicable to those students?
Yeah, so I think some of the concerns we've seen is when CPS was kind of first initially distributing computers, they wanted like a guardian's signature. And I know that was something they did agree if a student was unaccompanied, they would find, an alternative way to sign out the device. But I think just some of those technical things, especially if they are a minor, and obviously it's very hard to find youth shelters. There isn't a lot in Chicago. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think the last time I heard, Chicago had like over 2,000 identified unaccompanied homeless youth in the school system, but only like 300, youth beds. And so I think access to shelters, especially for minors, is very, very hard, and it's limited. And then I think also just with minors not being able to really sign leases or kind of have their own place. So if, there were probably was situations where maybe someone got sick or didn't, needed more kind of space to protect themselves. And if the youth, didn't have a space, I think it can be hard to find that alternative one. I think another thing we've seen a lot is with struggles accessing like higher education. So I know liaisons are supposed to assist unaccompanied youth with filling out the FAFSA as an independent student. So I think with kind of that in-classroom setting, that can be more challenging as well. And then one thing we dealt with a lot at the very beginning of the pandemic was issues with unaccompanied homeless youth not being able to stay at college in their dorms. So we had a lot of youth who were panicking because maybe they didn't, they were on spring break and they didn't really have the resources to travel back to their school so quickly to get their supplies. And then I think too, a lot of colleges, they don't have a liaison, right? That's not a requirement. Some colleges do kind of have a dedicated person. So I know we were working with a couple youth who we just didn't know who to contact at the school. And a lot of the schools were saying, oh, like they can come back and pick up their stuff, later in the semester. But if that was the only belongings, that student had, or maybe, they lived with someone who was older, who was more high risk, and they didn't want to go home after traveling and put them at risk. So I think that was a lot of concerns and issues that were going on with unaccompanied youth.
Yeah, I know it's something that we're dealing with in our state index, that we do focus on unaccompanied youth and the things that they have access to. And we're trying now to figure out how to incorporate pandemic things into it, because reaching those students seems to be an issue. And another one that ties into the next question is how can we best reach and serve unsheltered families? Especially when a lot of the help that we're seeing is providing hotspots or providing technology maybe to people who don't have access to charging those devices. And in McKinney-VENTO enrollment, it's already so hard to identify people, but as people are getting evicted, and we are probably seeing a lot of students that schools hadn't previously identified. So there's not a lot of that, keeping in touch with the same students. How do we best get to people who are living unsheltered.
This is Patricia. I mean, I know that what I'm hearing from school districts is really just relying heavily on community partners. So, you know, going out to campgrounds and seeing who's there and making connections and making sure that whoever is kind of there at that campground, if it's a park ranger or if it's a private campground, whatever, that they know enough about McKinney-Vento to be able to connect families to the liaison. If they're, you know, they know where the public bathrooms are, they're trying to put information there, places to do laundry, working really close with any place that's providing meals. So really just trying to get information out into the community where youth or families who are unsheltered might run into that information or run into somebody who can say, oh, hey, I see that you have a school-age child. Are you in touch with the school? Are you getting the support you need to be able to connect and access those resources? You know, I was talking with one liaison who in the spring, for sure, one of the big issues was just bathrooms. Everything was closed. So there were no public bathrooms, there were no public showers, and her youth who previously kind of had their places that they would go for those hygiene needs, all of a sudden didn't have any place to go. So even just raising awareness to getting those places back open again and saying this is an essential service. We have to have the bathroom open because we have people who need that service.
And sort of relatedly, I think it's really important right now for us as advocates and lawyers to make sure that, especially housing lawyers, can get all of this McKinney-Vento information to their clients at first contact. So, like, we have our toolkit. I know that many other organizations have McKinney-Vento flyers and toolkits, and just reaching people as soon as they might even be at risk is really important to making sure their children stay in school. Here's an interesting question. Are shelters changing their policies about day stays? I know a lot of shelters are only available in the evenings and kick people out during the day. So are they changing their stance now, especially for students in the daytime? Oh, I can't hear you, Paige. For anyone who can't. Oh, there you are. Yeah.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. I guess I needed a prompt on here to unmute. So thank you. I'm not familiar with every shelter policy in Philadelphia, but what we've definitely seen is really crackdowns on families. I've had multiple families be displaced from shelter because they needed to check on a relative or leave the shelter. And for young people who are experiencing homelessness on their own, the very limited shelters for young people have fewer beds available because of the need to physically distance and the need to have areas for people to isolate if they are suspected to have been exposed or in fact have been exposed. So that's one barrier that we've seen, is that families are put in an impossible position when schools are requiring them to physically present to locations because they could be staying in shelters or other places that have a rule that you cannot leave. And so I think that's one place where housing attorneys and attorneys who are working in the education space can be in communication with each other. I know, unfortunately, today, Philadelphia announced that the moratorium on evictions is going to stop on September 2nd, which also happens to be the very first day of school. And so I think we're in such challenging moments that having people who know the information can give the liaison's number, can give our numbers out. I know I provide my direct to families so they can reach me directly. They do not need to go through our hotline. They do not need to have those barriers. And so I've been getting a lot of messages that are just like, hey, Ms. Page, my number's changed, it's this. So one thing I've done in my practice throughout the summer is just calling and saying, are there things you need? So I've sent out countless emails and text messages with, here are food resources by you. These will change on Thursday. This is where you go instead. Yes, it is safe for you to leave your house if you have protective equipment? Do you have a hand sanitizer? These are the food locations. They're supposed to be physically distancing. And so making sure that lawyers can also be purveyors of public health information and resource information really matters, because I know when COVID first hit, our hotline was buzzing with questions about like, how long do I need to wash my hands for? Are there places with masks? Will I be arrested if I'm outside? Because in light of all of the protests, we had a curfew, which was unusual. And there wasn't information about how people who were living unsheltered would not be arrested by the police. And so I think this is a moment for collaboration. And the virtual environment has brought, at least in my experience, some unique opportunities for sharing knowledge with other attorneys who it would be very difficult to all get in the same physical space with, but online seems to open up new possibilities. So perhaps we could think innovatively about how to catch folks at different points when they're involved with lawyers and making sure everybody's talking, so it isn't, you know, traumatizing to have to work with a team of folks who may not be aware that each other exists.
Yeah, and that brings me to what coalitions are people working in right now? Are there new ones? Are people working with people in different fields, or are there coalitions of lawyers? At the Law Center, we have a listserv that's just lawyers who encounter educational issues. That's called Project Learn, and I'll include information in the follow-up email. And then we can include information about any coalitions you all are working with.
So I think one of the kind of unique and new ones that we've been participating in is this group in Illinois called Charge, which is a various healthcare providers. And I've done like numerous kind of presentations for them, which has been really helpful for identifying homeless families. So I know that's kind of one of our biggest concerns is families who became homeless during this time period, who maybe haven't been identified by schools, and if distance learning is, you know, happening in the fall, maybe aren't gonna be identified. And so we've been doing lots of presentations on how pediatricians can ask, you know, some questions and connect families to schools. And so I think that's been a really good and kind of new partnership because, you know, I think like schools, those pediatricians can also be kind of a source of consistency.
Yeah.
That's been one we've been working with.
I've been reminded that we need to get our polls done. So we might have time for one more question afterward, but let me do this really quick. We haven't really explicitly talked on this webinar about the human right to housing, but I think everything we do is really grounded in the fact that housing is a human right. So our first question, which should be coming up on your screens, is will you talk about the human right to housing in the future? Oh, here we go. So I'll leave that poll going for a few seconds. All right. Thank you. And then our second question is, will you use what you learned today to advocate for people experiencing homelessness, especially during COVID? Which, with everyone as advocates, I hope, I hope that's a yes. People were much quicker to vote on this poll. Okay, I'm going to close that poll. Thank you, everybody. We have just a couple minutes left. I want to put my contact information up here. You can email me. Phone calls will be a little harder because we're not in the office, but I'll be quick to respond on email, and I have my Twitter account here. The Law Center is active on Twitter, and so am I. And if there are any questions that are still lingering, I'm happy to put people in touch with people who can answer them or answer them myself. And we'll put all of the links to all the links that were mentioned and the slides and everyone's contact information into the follow-up email. And does anyone have anything, any of our panelists have anything they want to add really quickly at the end that we didn't get to say?
One thing that I just wanted to make a plug for, and I'm sorry if you can hear people are racing down Broad Street. This has been a phenomenon that has been endemic in my time working remotely. But one thing that I think is very important is that all of us as providers and advocates really normalize and emphasize the importance of mental health supports and self-care during this time, and making sure that young people know that a school is a place where they could access that support, and then making the connection, making sure that if there are things like counseling that can be offered, that can be something that somebody proactively asks the young person about, but it should be something that the young person engages. And if they want to, something I found to be effective is designating a point of contact so the young person can ask questions. But one thing that has been on my mind a lot is how we can best take care of each other physically and mentally during this time. And schools can play a role, but oftentimes they need a little gentle nudge to do it.
Thanks, Paige. That's such a great note to go out on a note of self-care and caring for one another. Thanks all of our panelists, Patricia, Alyssa, Paige, and especially Margaret. I think Margaret is off the line now, but I know that Alyssa can pass our thanks on to her. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll follow up in an email soon with all of this wonderful information. Have a great day.